Hi. So we're going to talk more about chronology. So we're going to go back to the Old Kingdom. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And we're going to put it in the slideshow form. Wait for it to fully load. Okay. So, like I said, last time we ended, we were talking about the Old Kingdom, and we had just kind of gotten started with that. And then people started getting home for the evening time in the household. So, last time I talked, or last video, talked about how the Old Kingdom is the first major period after the early dynastic when we have the centralized state. Traditionally, dynasties 3 through 6 are considered to sort of fall in that. The early dynastic is usually considered to be dynasties 1 through 2. I've also mentioned how, at least archaeologically speaking, the Old Kingdom seems to be when the royal family kind of holds the most absolute power, or at the very least has control over the most resources. So one of the ways that you tend to see this operate is that for a lot of the Old Kingdom, you have members of the royal family, particularly sons, that are officials within different parts of the government, particularly viziers. So these are members of the royal family that don't necessarily ever get to the throne, but they are related to the reigning pharaoh, and their viziers, or they fulfill some other function in the government. And then when they pass on, they have these very fancy mastabas. You also occasionally, in the Old Kingdom, have the daughters of the ruling pharaoh, or of the general family that's in power, marry non-royal male officials, and so there's connections made with the ruling family there as well. One of the other things that you see throughout the kingdom is that Ra is sort of the major sun deity or solar deity. So you see that in the royal funerary text, and in some other manifestations as well. For most of the Old Kingdom, most of the funerary evidence comes from the royal elite rather than the kind of everyday Egyptian. And for the period of time when the royal family power seems to have control of the most resources, it seems that officials and kind of the elite class seem to want to be buried as close to the pharaoh as possible. So that's why we have Giza and Saqqara, which are the main burial sites for kind of the official class, both royal and non-royal, during the Old Kingdom. You have the mortuary or funerary complex of the ruler, and then sort of clustered around him in satellite mastabas and shaft tombs, or her, as the case may be. You have members, what appears to be members of the court. So one of the reasons for this may be that these officials think they kind of have a higher chance of the afterlife if they're in physical or in closer physical proximity to the person that's kind of on the throne. Also, during the Old Kingdom, Memphis is the main capital, both in a religious and in an administrative sense. Memphis continues to be used as a important city after the Old Kingdom, but it loses a lot of its main ritual significance, and kind of Thebes shifts to being the main ritual and religious center. But Memphis is still used by different ruling dynasties and different rulers all the way down to the Roman period. It's just used in different ways. One of the other things that we also see in the Old Kingdom that we don't see after is we see I think it's dynasties 5 and 6. Some of the rulers set up, in addition to their mortuary, so in addition to their pyramid complexes that they're entombed in, they also set up these royal solar temples to the deity Ra. And most of these are at the site of Abusir, which is close to Saqqara. It's within that same pyramid fields area that I'll talk about a little bit more few slides on. And most of these solar temples, except for one or two, have not really survived intact all that well. We do have, and the name of the ruler is escaping me, but for one of them, we do have administrative documents that were found in the solar temple. And so this gives us an idea of kind of how at least one of these was sort of run on a day-to-day basis, but most of the architecture that, would have made them so posing, we really don't have anymore. So for the actual solar temples, for most of them, we just have the foundations. So we've seen these before, and I'm just going to mainly focus on this one over here because it gives you a good idea of sort of where, during the Old Kingdom at least, the administrative and kind of cultural center of country was, which is in that area of Egypt and sort of the Delta region. So we have the pyramid fields, which basically which surround what was the capital of Memphis. Much of Memphis, or at least a portion of it, is under modern Cairo. So Cairo was constructed when the Muslim forces came in, and so as Egypt urbanized and the population expanded, we have areas of antique Memphis that basically get covered up by Cairo. So modern day Cairo is sort of in this region, and most of the remains that we have for ancient Memphis are now in the modern day village of Mit Rimna, I think. So in Old Kingdom, this was sort of the main center of the country. When you get down to the Middle Kingdom and then the New Kingdom, things kind of move down, particularly for religious center. Things move down to and Middle Egypt in Thebes. And in the Old Kingdom, they did have, like I said before, they did have trade relationships with parties, that went in and out of the desert. So the Sinai Peninsula, they had mining. The pharaohs or the kings, because during the Old Kingdom they didn't yet have the name of pharaohs. There was they did have mining. The rulers did have mining operations that we can trace in the Sinai Peninsula. And we do have from biographies of officials in the Old Kingdom on their tombs, we know that different rulers sent or sometimes led expeditions down into Nubia, so roughly where modern day Sudan is, for gold and kind of other resources as well. But it's not until the New Kingdom, which is much later, that Nubia is fully, what the Egyptians called Nubia, is fully colonized as an Egyptian, basically colonial possession. So for the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom, I'm going to kind of divide it into two chunks. I'm going to talk about the political history and then kind of go into some of the social history. So a lot of these will overlap. You could probably make arguments for something that I put in political history along just as well in the social history, but I figured for convenience, that's kind of a a good way to at least roughly separate them. So I'm going to go into the political, kind of a summary of the political history of the Old Kingdom first here. This is from that Digital Egypt for University site. And this is the individual rulers, because remember they don't yet have the title of pharaoh. So the individual kings, but there's also possible, particularly in the early dynastic, there's possible female rulers as well. So as I said, traditionally the Old Kingdom is considered to be dynasties 3 through 6. So Dynasty 3 is where we get the step pyramid at Saqqara. Dynasty 4 is where we get to the use of the Giza Plateau for a royal burial site and the pyramids there. Dynasty 5, we're starting to get what are called the pyramid texts, and they kind of, at least the royal family stops using Giza as a burial site and sort of goes back to the site of Saqqara. And then Dynasty 6 also uses Saqqara for a burial site as well, rather than Giza. Okay, so now this is also from Digital Egypt. It just kind of gives a little bit more information on some of these more important rulers from some of these dynasties. So, like I mentioned, we have the ruler, because one of the other things that you see starting to emerge in the Old Kingdom is multiple names of the rulers. So Egyptologists have given this the terminology of the fivefold royal titulary, which is basically by the new kingdom, you have the ruler has 5 names that basically speak to different aspects of her or his rulership, both kind of ideological and religious and political. And so some of these names are less known to the public. Some of them are more well known. So, for instance, the king that most people know as Joshur or Doshur, who seems to have been responsible for ordering the step pyramid to be built, and that seems to be his main burial place. The name that we actually get for the Old Kingdom in contemporary sources is his Horus name, which is Netjer Ket. And the Horus name is referring to kind of a more religious aspect of the god Horus, who we also see prominently linked with kingship starting in the Old Kingdom all the way to the New. And basically it refers, or Egyptologists argue that it refers to the sort of royal aspect of the royal life force when the ruler is on the throne and kind of alive. And then it's only later on that we have the name Doshur or Joshur that is given to him in later sources. And again, you see the years are about 2686 to 2600 BC, because again, I talked about how the further back you go, which the Old Kingdom is definitely included in this, the dates become more and more uncertain in terms of absolute calendar years. So this is just a picture of part of the step pyramid complex, because it's a whole funerary complex. One of the theories for the kind of above ground funerary part of it that's not the step pyramid itself, which is this, which they think the the ruler was actually, interred in a chamber underneath this. But one of the theories for why they needed the funerary complex as a whole, which is more this part, is for a particular ceremony, which is called the Hepsed ceremony, which is basically a ceremony of renewal of kingship that you first see in the Old Kingdom. And so one of the theories is that this was set up for Dosher's afterlife so that he could perform this, or his spirit could perform this ceremony into eternity. But I don't think there's a lot of documentation from the period that says, yes, this is definitely why they built this. It's just one of the theories for maybe how this funerary complex, or they envisioned the different uses of this funerary complex. So this is where Saqqara is, which is where the step pyramid complex is. So that's Memphis, which was the main Old Kingdom capital. And so Saqqara is within this area of burial grounds called the Pyramid Fields, which is basically seems to be the desert areas surrounding Memphis that were right outside the cultivatable zone that served as royal burials. And modern Egyptology has basically divided these pyramid fields into 6 or 7 sites. So we have Giza, Saqqara, Abu Sir, and some others as well. This is some of the other monuments that are in Saqqara from some of the later dynasties and earlier dynasties as well. So like this is the Teti pyramid, is a pyramid that was for the burial of a 5th or 6th dynasty ruler. Then we have the site of Abu Sir within the pyramid fields, that's kind of right on the edge there. And then this is roughly where kind of Memphis would have been. And then this is the step pyramid complex as a whole. So that 3rd dynasty ruler with his step pyramid and the whole burial complex. So this is a graphic of the pyramid as a whole, as it may have looked, when it was fully in its glory. So this is the step pyramid. So the assumption is that Net Jeker, which again is the name that Dosher is given in the contemporary text that we have for him, because it's his Horus name. Egyptologists think that he was interred in a shaft under this step pyramid structure. And then his mortuary temple was somewhere in here. And the mortuary temple is basically a temple or a structure that you see all the way past the New Kingdom. And the idea is that you need, for both royal and non-royal spirits, you need a place to bring offerings to that spirit of, or with the essence of food and drink, so that spirit can continue to exist in the afterlife. And of course, the more elite and the more resources you have, the bigger you can afford to go on that space. And in the Old Kingdom, what you tend to see is, at least for the royal families, is the burial place, so where the body is actually interred, which tends to be, particularly after the 3rd dynasty, tends to be a pyramid type structure, is in the same general location as the mortuary temple. And so that's what you see with the step pyramid complex here. And then we have the part of the complex, which the majority of Egyptologists, or at least kind of the current going theory, is for the king spirit to kind of do that said festival, so do that renewal of kingship in perpetuity. So that said festival here. And then you have some other buildings that they're still kind of trying to figure out the exact reasons for, and then the overall enclosure wall to kind of protect the structure, from just random visitors. Because there would be, after this ruler died, he would have assigned resources to a class of priests or priestesses that would basically staff his mortuary temple so that his spirit could continue to get the sustenance that it needed. So you would have seen on a daily basis at least some people going in and out of this structure or out of this complex as a whole for at least certain amount of time after the ruler died. All right. This is inside the burial chamber. So now we're getting into the actual step pyramid structure. So this is, you're going inside this building here, and you're basically starting to go underground to where the actual burial shaft is. So this is the different stages of the step pyramid and kind of how it's divvied up and where the actual burial vault may have been. And these are blue tiles. So again, when this was first built, it would have been very colorful and very fancy. This is a more detailed view of the different parts of that step pyramid. This is from that publication by Eleanor Sullivan, her digital book that looks in depth at the history of Saqqara and really kind of takes a 3D view. So this is if someone was standing on the floodplain east kind of the general area of Saqqara, roughly in early Memphis, around Dynasty 3. So around the time the step pyramid complex was being built and kind of what that observer might have been able to see. So the step pyramid is within that complex would have been the most prevalent feature that really would have risen above the landscape, and then a bit of that enclosure wall would have been visible probably as well. And then you get into Dynasty 4 in the Old Kingdom, and now we're getting into the true pyramid shape, and we're also moving to the Giza Plateau as the main royal burial site rather than Saqqara. So Saqqara was still being used for non-royal burials, but for whatever reason, again, Egyptologists are still debating exactly why. You have the kings that for most of Dynasty 4 choose to be buried on the Giza Plateau, and it seems that their officials and kind of their courts follow suit rather than at Saqqara. So these probably are some of the more famous pharaohs because they were then talked about by the Greeks in terms of early pyramid sites at Giza were. So this is again from the Digital Egypt. So again, we have those approximate dates for Dynasty 4. These rulers, so Khufu and Khafre, were the or at least one of their names for both Khufu and Khafre were the builders of two of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. So that's why the arrows are there. You also see here that by Dynasty 4, we're getting more elements of that fivefold royal titulary. So, for instance, for Khufu from contemporary documents, and in Greeks, or the Greeks called him Cheops, we know his Horus name was Medjetu. His Nepti name was Nepti Ar Medjed. Those first two names refer to deities and kind of more the religious side of rulership. And then we have his golden falcon name is Beaky Nub, his nomen, so basically his personal name, which is the name that most people, if they know a ruler of Egypt, they tend to know the nomen or throne or personal name. And that is the Khufu one. And so that's the name by which most non-Egyptologists know him. But if you see these other names in the archaeological record, they're talking about Khufu as well. So all these names talking about the same ruler. And then the same thing for Khafre, or Chephren, as he's known in Greek, and then Menkaure, who's the builder of the last pyramid on the Giza Plateau there during the Fourth Dynasty. So we have most of their names as well. So like Khafre, again, from contemporary sources, we have his Horus name, we have his Neptune name, we have his Golden Falcon name, and we have his nomen. So we have 4 out of the 5. Menkaure is the same thing. So Menkaure is the personal name, but we also have his Horus name, we have his Neptune name, and we have his Golden Falcon name. And again, these more detailed shots are from the Digital Egypt for Universities site. Okay, so I talked a little bit about how in the Third Dynasty, the sort of favored place for royal burial seems to be Saqqara. Then during the Fourth Dynasty, there seems to be a switch to Giza. And the reasons for kind of that switch are still not fully understood. I also talked about how in the Old Kingdom, the actual burial spot, so the place where you inter the royal mummy, and the building or kind of location for offerings to that spirit so it can continue to have an afterlife, aka the mortuary temple, tend to be in the same place. And I also talked about how at both Giza and Saqqara, so for most of the Old Kingdom, you have these sort of courtiers and members of the court that when they die, they choose to be buried in physical proximity to the ruler. So you kind of see these clusters around royal tombs. And one of the reasons for that might be that they think there's a higher chance of kind of reaching the afterlife if they're buried in that closer physical proximity to their rulers. One of the other things that I didn't mention that you see in the early dynastic period, so now we're going back in time a little bit, at the site of Abydos, which is the very first royal burial site, and in particular the sub-site of el-Quab, there's good evidence that we may see instances of retainer sacrifice. So courtiers either willingly or semi-willingly choosing to follow their ruler into the afterlife a bit early. If that is in fact what is going on, we don't see evidence for that at Abydos past Dynasty. I think it's past Dynasty 2. So definitely by the time we get to Dynasty 3, if that did occur in kind of that first century or so of Egyptian statehood, the courtier or elite class that's not on the throne has gotten enough power to say, we're not going to do that anymore. That's not going to be a thing. All right. So one of the other things that I sort of alluded to, but didn't fully lay out, is that if you look at the basic setup of a royal funerary complex versus a non-royal, in its fundamentals, it's basically the same. So there's two things that both a royal person and a non-royal person in kind of the Egyptian afterlife beliefs need. So you need a place to inter the actual mummy. So whether that's a simple hole in the ground, whether that's a fancy pyramid, whether that's just a shaft tomb, whether that's a mastaba, you need a place to put those physical remains. Because of the way, at least that written sources from the Old Kingdom tell us on, you need a place or a complex or multiple complexes so that spirit could receive offerings of food and drink so that they could thrive in the afterlife. How fancy you could make one or both of those spaces depends on your resources. So if you're a member of the royal family, that particularly in the kingdom periods has access to a lot of the state treasury and a lot of economic resources, you can afford to go really big. If you're just an average Egyptian farmer, you can maybe not afford to go as fancy. So that's just something to keep in mind. So in terms of the elite tomb complex, so not necessarily the above ground space where the spirit was given offerings, but where the actual mummy, where the actual physical remains were interred. The very general trend over time was a mastaba, which comes from the Arabic word for bench, and it's basically a kind of square shaped structure. And one of the ideas for the step pyramid is that it was basically a fancier mastaba. Because if you look at the step pyramid, it's like 6 or 7 mastaba type structures that are layered one on top of the other. And so at Giza and Saqqara, for a lot of the elite royal tombs, so members of the royal family that were elite but didn't necessarily reach the throne, but kind of were in the official class at Giza and Saqqara during the Old Kingdom, you have their tombs, so the space where the actual bodies were interred, first going to a mastaba or something that's roughly square shaped. Then it goes to a pyramid by the time you're getting to the 4th through about 6 dynasties, so kind of the later Old Kingdom. And then there's some unique things that happen during some of the intermediate periods. And then by the time you get to the Middle Kingdom, you have that pyramid, because rulers still choose to do, at least some of the Middle Kingdom rulers choose to be interred in pyramids out in the Fayum region. And then by the time you get to the New Kingdom, that's where you have the rock-cut royal tombs in the valleys of the kings and queens. So there's a lot more detail than that, but that's kind of the overall trajectory of the shapes that the kind of the royal bodies were entombed in over that vast span of pharaonic Egypt. So I also mentioned a few slides ago that depending on the chunk of time that you're looking at, the style for the design of kind of both of those parts. So where the chamber space where the actual physical remains were interred versus that more above ground commemorative space or spaces changes. So I talked about how, generally speaking, prior to the New Kingdom, definitely for the royal family, you have the space where the body is interred, kind of the offering commemorative space in the same general physical location. When you start to get into the Middle Kingdom, so it's actually, generally speaking, prior to the Middle Kingdom, the tomb and commemorative spaces are generally in the same location. When you get to the Middle Kingdom, and definitely by the New Kingdom, but the Middle Kingdom is kind of where you first see the trend start. You have rulers, namely Mentuhotep II is kind of of the 11th dynasty who first begins it. He chooses to have his mortuary temple, so the space where his spirit receives offerings, kind of his commemorative space, in a separate location or somewhat separate location from where his physical mummy is actually interred. And it's also in the New Kingdom and during his reign that you start to see the general area of Thebes, rather than Giza or Saqqara being used as a kind of favored location for royal burial. Okay, so so with the Old Kingdom, I talked about how the kind of general burial ground was in what Egyptologists have labeled the pyramid fields, which were basically the available grounds outside of the capital of Memphis, which is roughly here, and these mark some of the ruins of Memphis that we still have. So this is all basically desert land that's right outside of that cultivatable fields zone. And so it seems that basically this whole area was one continuous burial ground that probably had lots of different names. And modern day Egyptology has chunked this area into 6 or 7 sites. So we have Giza, we have Abu Ghraib, we have Abu Sir, we have Saqqara, and we have Dashur. Similar to what I talked about with the kingdoms and intermediate if you somehow got the ability to time travel, and back to the Old Kingdom, and you went to ask a random Egyptian, can you tell me where Saqqara is? You would probably get a slightly quizzical look, because Saqqara is, our modern term for a geographical area that in pharaonic times was probably called something completely different. So that's just something to keep in mind when modern day Egyptology talks about kind of where Abu Ghraib ends versus where Abu Sir ends, is these boundaries are somewhat artificial and kind of have been imposed from the outside. And this map is also good because you tells you where modern day Cairo is as well. So this is from the other side of the bank. So the ancient capital of Memphis, or one of its older names, Men-Nefer, with some of those pyramid field sites and kind of the edge of the cultivatable land desert area here. Okay, so you look at a lot of these pyramid field sites, and one of the things that you notice is they seem to be completely in the desert. So you're like, how do they get all the stones there? Like, there's no water. Like, it doesn't. And so the old idea was that, okay, well, they just waited until the Nile was in flood, and then the stones could be floated to these pyramid plateau sites. And they basically use a system of corvée, and again, this is the old idea, they use system of corvée or state labor, because when your fields are flooded, you can't farm. So that's when they use the farmers' labor. I think after this slide, I'm going to take a quick break. The newer view is that the Nile floodwaters weren't quite high enough to actually do that. So what they actually probably did is there were natural lakes in the landscape that have since dried up. And if there weren't natural lakes already there, then they would create courses and basically man-made harbors near the pyramid fields as well. So Mark Leonard in his The Complete Pyramids, that publication goes into more depth about this theory and kind of the evidence that supports it. So again, I've just put the page number if you want to get the book and really kind of dive into that aspect. So again, this is from that page 13, going to a little bit more detail of sort of how these pyramid lakes might have formed. Dashur Lake is the only remaining example of one of these pyramid lakes that we still have. So this gives you some idea of how they could get those stones to these desert sites. This is another image of Dashur Lake. So, like I talked about before, the Nile water courses and channels have moved over time. So that's what this graph to. And we're gonna stop. I think doggies heard something. Hush.